Tonight we take a look on the other side of the coin. We talked a little bit about the um, underworld, Sheol and Hades, and those type of words, Tartarus and Gehenna over the last few weeks. Now we're going to kind of flip the coin, and over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about heaven. And so tonight this is lesson number 8, your handout, and we're going to talk about this as a tension point in the scriptures only because of the way it's talked about between the Old and the New Testament. And the way I want to begin tonight is I want us to think about how we who live kind of within a New Testament frame of mind, usually when we hear the word heaven, we think of it in singular. We think of it as a place beyond. And there's a lot of different caricatures that we attach to it. Some of it is theological, but some of it is just kind of mythological. And what I mean by that is when we think of heaven, we think of it being a place where God resides. Perhaps we think of it as his throne room. We might think of it as a place that we go after we pass and we are rewarded for a life well lived. We might think of it as a place of perfection, a place where there's no pain or sorrow that we experience in this life. It is a very mysterious idea to us because uh, we've never been there, obviously. So we don't have any firsthand account or acknowledge someone who's been there and come back and tell us what it's like. Although there are times when we know that people have been revived from passing away, and they do have some common descriptions, light and warmth and comfort and different things like that. I guess when you look into the scriptures, the end picture of heaven is kind of like a city, a new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, adorned as a bride for her husband type of thing. Revelation tells us in the end. But we really can't describe what it looks like. And it is something that I think is quite humorous when we think about how we talk about heaven. We talk about the pearly gates, we talk about the streets of gold, we talk about perhaps some type of eternal setting where there is endless worship, or there's all kinds of things that we think about when we consider this subject. Tonight, what I want us to do is to begin to think about this topic in some of the same ways that we talked about the underworld. Remember, we had several words that we used when we talked about Sheol, the place of the grave, that became Hades under Greek influence. And then we talked a little bit about Gehenna. And then we finally ended up with one word that's not used very often, Tartarus. Well, I want to use this same graphic to think about heaven. We want to talk about tonight and next week heavens, plural, in the Old Testament. And then if you look here, there's another element in the Old Testament we don't give much consideration to, but it's found all through the Old Testament. And it is the place of the assembly of the gods, or the divine council. We'll get to that next week, not tonight. And then finally, when we come to the New Testament, we begin using the word not in a plural form, but in a singular form. We begin to talk about heaven. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Those type of concepts as a singular place of destination. So the push and pull of the concept of heaven is the use of plurals in the Old Testament, the use of this idea of a divine council, of which Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, is king over the assembly that is there. And then finally, this idea of heaven as it is found in some of the New Testament scriptures. So, having said that, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to take just a look at this idea of heavens, plural, in the Old Testament. So, if you have a Bible, we're going to be not looking at all of these references that I put down. That's way too much. But I will look at a couple of things. And in Genesis chapter 1, maybe you've noticed this before, maybe you haven't. But verse 1 of Genesis 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens, plural, and the earth, singular." Now we need to stop right there and understand that when we are thinking of how the Old Testament is presented, heavens, plural, is this idea of something beyond the atmosphere, the surrounding atmosphere. And what we find is in Genesis chapter 1, there is almost as if there is different zones to heaven. And the first one is the atmospheric heaven. And we see that down in verse 8 here in my New International Version. It uses the word vault, which is very interesting. So in verse 1 of Genesis, verse 6 of Genesis 1, it says, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." Now, we're going to try to get an understanding of what that's talking about in a second. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. So there's this idea of when you look into the heavens, there is like a dome or a vault that was thought of as a way of holding the stars in place. I'll show you a graphic of that in a couple of moments. When we think of the heavens, plural, we're thinking beyond the atmosphere that holds the sun and the moon and the stars. Sometimes it's translated the expanse in other translations, but here in the New International Version, it's called a vault, which is kind of interesting because it's trying to give to us an understanding of how the ancients tended to look at cosmology. That is, how the world sits in relationship to what we observe around us. So the heavens are used quite often in different ways. You'll notice at the bottom of this slide here, even after the flood, the sign of the Noahic covenant, this promise that God will not destroy the earth by means of a flood, is a rainbow in the heavens. So there's this idea of looking up and seeing God's promise. Another thing is we have been on Sunday morning talking a little bit about a few of the covenants that God made in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament covenant that God makes with Abraham is related to the heavens as well. He takes Abraham out and he says, "Look up into the sky. Can you count the amount of stars that are there? Um, if you cannot count the amount of stars that are in the sky, this will be like your descendants. They will be too numerous to count." And it's a promise of his ongoing legacy, starting this line of people that will become the Israelites of the Old Testament. So, oh, here comes Helen. I'm letting her in. Good. So here we are thinking a little bit about how the word heavens, plural, is being used at the very beginning here in Genesis chapter 1. Now, the starting point in trying to understand the cosmology of the Old Testament is to think of it in terms of how they looked at what they could perceive. And so the starting point for us is we live on this skin of a giant globe. Well, you got to get that out of your head when it comes to the Old Testament. They didn't think of the earth as a globe. They will think of it in relationship to a flat surface with a dome above it. So when we think of this globe that we live on, we realize that we circle a star that we call the sun, but this sun is one of millions of stars in probably as many galaxies as well. The Old Testament persons looked at it pretty consistently among different tribes in the ancient Near East. This isn't just Israel's point of view, it is also the point of view of the Egyptians. It's the point of view of the Sumerians and other tribes that go that far back. Now, we tend to think of things in terms of animate and inanimate objects. So we look at animals, an animate creation. Plants, something that is animate as well. One of the things you're going to notice, though, is in the Old Testament, even things that are inanimate, rocks, mountains, those type of things, are also considered filled with the presence of God in some way. And it's reflected when you see different things in the scriptures, like, the rocks crying out, the mountains calling forth, different things like that. So Westerners tend to think of this rigid distinction between animate and inanimate objects, but ancient Israelites and really the whole ancient Near East talks about the created order as if it is alive and conscious and able to respond to God. The heavens are declaring the glory of God. It's almost as if it's speaking, that type of thing. So I listed a few things here that you can see that are considered as inanimate objects in our frame of thinking that are considered to be somehow animated in praising God. The stars, the waters above the sky, the waters in the sea, trees, mountains, all of these type of things, while we think of them as inanimate objects, what we find is that there is this animation, or we might say mysticism, in the ancient thinking, that these inanimate objects can also give forth praise to God. Now, that could be metaphorical only. That is, you look at something like the stars in the sky, and it's speaking to me metaphorically, not audibly, but metaphorically, and so forth. So, you know what I'm going to do? I'm getting a little bit of feedback here, so I'm gonna put you on mute just for a second so that I don't get that feedback. Okay, great. So now let's think just for a moment so we understand where the Israelites are coming from an ancient perspective. So Egyptians, big cosmological ideas in the Egyptian accounts. But the main thing to note about the Egyptians is when you look at different accounts that give to us a perspective of Egyptian life, what you find is that the earth was considered to be a flat expanse. And under it is the underworld, and above it is the sky. And what's interesting is this idea of a sky that is a watery place, and that each day the sun god would take a boat across this expanse. And that's how they pictured the idea of the sun coming up and the sun going down, is that the sun god would travel this water from one end to the other and then would do it again the next day. There's also a whole lot of balance in the way the Egyptians looked at the cosmos. You have order and you have chaos, you have light and you have dark, you have life and you have death. Now, remember the area, the big area around Israel is called Mesopotamia. And that includes areas today that include Iran and Iraq. And so it's a huge area that includes Israel. Well, there was a lot of different types of tribes that dwelt in Mesopotamia, but they had a very similar outlook to the heavens. They tended to divide the perspective of their cosmology into two zones, the heavenly and the earthly. But in each of those, there is a subdivision. So you have three levels to the heavens and you have three levels to the earth. And I'm going to show you that on a chart in a second. Each level was considered to have a stone floor. So sort of like a three-story house. There's these three zones and each has a floor that is symbolized in color. The highest being red, the middle being blue, and the lower zone being jasper or a variety of different colors. So here's how it looks. And hopefully this will make sense. In the ancient world, the way they looked at their existence within the cosmos is between the heavenly and the earthly. Within the heavenly, you have three subdivisions, upper, middle, and lower. These belong to certain gods. So in ancient Mesopotamia, Anu was the king of the gods, and the Iggy is a form of gods that are the offspring of these gods down here called the Anakai. Couldn't get that out. Which is interesting in their storyline that these gods were the gods who determined the fate of humanity and that they were imprisoned. But they viewed each level as having their own set of gods and color. So in heaven, you had Anu, the king of the gods, the Iggy, and then the stars. Now, I'll show you in a moment that they believed that the stars were also gods. So when they looked up, they thought of these three different levels, and they each are filled with different types of gods. Now, on Earth, you also have three subdivisions, the upper, the middle, and the lower. The upper is where we live on Earth. The middle is the water under the ground. So, you drill not just for gas or oil, but you also can drill for water. So there's water in the middle of the earth. And then the lower is the underworld. So that's the area that holds the dead as well as these gods that have been imprisoned. Now, for human beings, they have exposure to two out of all six of these. We live on the upper level of earth, but we can look up and see the lower level of heaven. So as humanity, we live on the earth, but we can look up and see the stars, the sun, and the moon. So hopefully that makes sense. That chart will help a little bit. The stone floor is an interesting concept. It's considered as a flat area upon which each level of the heavens sits. So now, how did the Israelites look at the heavens? Well, they were very close in their perspective, but Genesis chapter 1 fills it out a little bit. So instead of having three subdivisions of heaven, the Israelites had four. And then there's three levels of earth, just like the rest of the Mesopotamians. Now, the main division in heaven for the Israelites was the highest heaven. That's what we're going to talk about next week. This area where God, the divine council, and the angels reside. Then the three below the highest heavens include the waters that are above the skies, and then the next one that is the firmament or the sky dome, or as the New International Version says, the vault that contains the sun and the moon and the stars. And then finally, the atmosphere, what is immediately above us, where weather affects us, and that's where the birds fly, that type of thing. Nowadays, in the 21st century, the atmosphere is where we fly our airplanes as well. So now, the second division, again, is earthly, and it's the same, basically, as we saw on the previous slide. You have where humanity dwells, on land and sea, but not only humans, also animals, fish, and the belief of sea monsters as well is common within the Israelite framework. Then you have the water under the earth. It includes the seas, obviously, the creatures of the seas, but the water under the earth is also found in other places beside the ocean. Then you have Sheol, which is the place of the dead. So in Israelite thinking, you have these 4 subdivisions in heaven, 3 on earth. Now, this should help you then begin to understand how Genesis chapter 1 is written. You are given the different zones, if you will, and then those zones are filled with different types of species. And in the first 3 days, God creates these zones. In the second set of 3 days, that's when they are filled with animal and human life. So now, here's what's important to keep in mind. When we're thinking about heaven, again, we're often thinking about heaven only in terms of New Testament perspective. We think of it as the place we go after we pass away. But as you can see here, these different zones that are here also play into the stories that we find in the Old Testament as well. For example, the zones, for the most part, are kind of restricted to the gods, but occasionally people can pass through these zones. So obviously, all people descend into this dwelling place of the dead in Sheol. However, there are stories in the Old Testament which are quite spectacular when you read about how both Enoch was no more, Genesis tells us, as if he went through the zones of heaven. And Elijah, when he's about ready to leave, he hands Elisha his mantle and he passes through the zones of heaven, and that is where he dwells. There's some fluidity there, but there's restrictions. Not everyone can do that. It's interesting in the transfiguration account of Jesus that Elijah and Moses also come with Jesus and is with him in this transfiguration account, as if they pass from heaven back down to earth and then they go back away. So the Bible begins, the most important thing to observe is in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens, plural. Now, we might think of that as a little bit odd because we use it as a singular. But there's a lot of nouns that we use as plurals. We just don't think of it that way. I give you a couple of examples here. Trousers, scissors, clothes. I put on my clothes. If I want to say a singular item of clothing that I put on, I don't say I put on my clothes. Okay? You then specify, I put on my shoes, I put on my shirt, I put on my pants. Again, there's a plural as well. I don't put on my pant. I put on my pants. I put on my trousers. I don't put on a trouser. Okay, so it's interesting, even in our language, we have plural words that refer sometimes to singular items. I don't think of trousers, even though it's kind of a plural word, as a plural item. I got one set of one. Uh, I can't even express it without using the expression. I put on a pair of pants, a pair of trousers, which is interesting. Even that suggests the plural. So that's important in considering how they look at the heavens. Now, the other thing that's important to keep in mind is they thought of the world not in terms of a globe, but a flat surface. So what happens when you read through different scriptures, you'll come across words like this, the four corners of the earth. Well, that's a flat earth perspective, okay? You have north, south, east, west on a flat surface. You have the ends of the earth is mentioned at times in the scripture. Well, on a globe, the earth doesn't end, it continues. But in their perspective, there is a place where the earth ends. Now, another one is pillars. Now, this is fascinating to me. The pillars upon which the earth sits. In other words, there's this idea that something is holding this flat surface up, okay? And then words like foundation, that the earth's foundation is set by God. So those type of scriptures only make sense with a flat earth mentality. Now, there are still some people around that have, they are flat earth conspiratorial type people. Guess who was one of them? I don't know if he still is. Kyrie Irving of the one at one time of the Cavs still believed that the earth was flat. So there's people out there that still kind of assume this. But that's the common denominator in the Old Testament. The earth is flat. So what is the curve then? That you look out on the horizon and you see kind of a curve when the sun goes down. The ancients believed that you are observing the dome that is above the flat surface. Okay, well, let me get to this. Take a look. So this is how we're putting it all together. So here is the earth, and down here are the pillars of the earth that holds the earth up. Below the earth is Sheol, and then above is this vault or this dome, and that's where the moon and the sun reside, the firmament. But then they believed that there was waters above that dome, and that when the rain would come to earth, that there were gates or these areas with which are opened by the gods to allow water to come down and fill the seas and water the ground and that type of thing. So this is kind of the common mentality. We're on Earth, the upper chamber of Earth, and we look up and see the lower chamber of heaven. But above that is something that they call the waters above. Now let's go back to Genesis here. Genesis chapter 1. Hopefully now this will make a little bit more sense. Verse 1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Okay, then it goes on and it says, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, He separated light from darkness. God, he called the light day, and darkness he called night. There was evening, there was morning the first day. Then verse 6, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. Okay, you have water down here, but you have water up here, and there is a vault that separates the two sets of water. And so God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from above the water, from the water above it. And it was so. And God called the vault sky. So the vault is now called sky, or firmament is another word that is used. And then verse 9, God said, let the water under the sky, or firmament, be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear. So there's this evolutionary process that's going on here. And it was so, and God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters he called the sea. Okay. So I'll come back to this again in a moment. So what you have to keep in mind here is that the language of the Old Testament assumes flatness, and the curve is the dome that's above. Now, they spoke of things as it appeared to them. In other words, it looks like the sun is rising. It looks like the sun is setting. But in reality, the truth of the matter is the earth is going around the sun. The sun is not moving, the earth is. And even though it feels like the earth is static and that it's not moving, at the same time, it is moving quite quickly. When you think about how far the earth rotates, and then in the course of a year, the rotation around the sun. Well, the ancients had no way of knowing any of that. So they told us about their experience as they perceived it. It's only through scientific data that we're able to see how the cosmos is organized. And there's a guy by the name of Copernicus that comes along, and he proposes this theory that the sun is not revolving around the earth is revolving around the sun. He was persecuted for that, because that was a new theory. Now, here's a couple of things that are quite fascinating to me. I don't know if you've ever come across these stories or not, but it pertains to how they saw the heavens above them. So if you have your Bible, go to 2 Kings chapter 20. Okay, go to the right from Genesis. You'll go past Deuteronomy, Judges, Samuel, and then you'll get to Kings. And when you get to 2 Kings, I want you to stop at chapter 20. And this is an interesting story that kind of illustrates for us their perspective. So in this particular chapter, one of the kings of Judah by the name of Hezekiah, he gets quite ill. And he is full of grief because of his illness. And we're told that Isaiah comes to him and tells him that God is going to add 15 years to his life. So it goes on, and Hezekiah wants some type of sign that this is going to happen, that God's going to give him another 15 years of life. And so it says down in verse 8, it says, Hezekiah asked Isaiah, what will be the sign that the Lord will heal me, and that I will go up to the temple of the Lord on the third day from now? Isaiah answered, this is the Lord's sign to you, that the Lord will do what he has promised. Shall the shadow go forward 10 steps, or shall it go back 10 steps? Well, it's a simple matter for the shadow to go forward 10 steps, said Hezekiah. Rather have it go back 10 steps. So to understand this, you have to think of the sun that's producing a shadow of a person on the ground. And as the sun is moving from one end of the vault to the other, the shadow continues to move, obviously. Well, Hezekiah is thinking in terms of, well, it'll move ahead 10 steps. That's what it normally does. I want the shadow to go in reverse 10 steps as the sign that I am going to be healed. Now, I have no idea how to explain this other than understanding that their mindset was they live on a flat surface and the sun is moving and is changing the perspective of the shadow. Verse 11 says, Then the prophet Isaiah called on the Lord, and the Lord made the shadow go back 10 steps. It had gone down on the stairway of Ahaz. Okay, good luck on explaining what's going on here. Okay, my point is that the way they perceive the skies or heavens has to do with we're on a flat surface, the sun is moving from one end to the other, make it stop and make it go back to produce a reverse shadow. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that because I can't explain what actually happened here other than that's what Hezekiah wanted as a sign that he's going to be healed. Okay. Another example of that is in the book of Joshua. So if you go back to Joshua, chapter 10. So as you know, the book of Joshua is about the conquering of the land. So they go into the land of Canaan and they are taking on their opponents, and their opponents obviously are in their way of possessing this land. In chapter 10 of Joshua, you have a listing of some of the people that they are fighting against. And you can see some of it in the first paragraph, verses 1 through 4. And then verse 5, there's these 5 kings of the Amorites that take up their position, and they begin to fight the Israelites. Verse 6 says, the Gibeonites sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all of the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us. So Joshua goes up to Gilgal with his army. And it says in verse 9, after an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel, so Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. Israel pursued them all along the road up to Beth Horon and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel on the road from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed from the swords of the Israelites. And on that day, the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel. Joshua said in the presence of Israel, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as written in the book of Jasher. Well, the book of Jasher is not in the Bible. That's some type of extra biblical account. But then there's this explanation. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. Okay. So Joshua is saying, I want, again, flat earth mentality. The sun is coming up, the sun is going down. We need more daylight to finish off these enemies. And he prays that God will cause the sun to stand still, and it does for a full day. Okay. Well, if that actually happened, scientifically, it would create all kinds of uh, problems in the systems of the Earth. But the way the story is told is from the perspective of a flat Earth perspective. And so this idea of the sun standing still is this idea of I want it to stop mid-sky so that we can finish this. So again, what you do with this, I'm not sure. Again, did this really happen? People that are extreme literalists will say it says so right there in the Bible. That has to be the way it happened. But again, there's implications that if that did happen, there would be cause and effects of causing the Earth to stop for an entire day in its rotation, because we know it's a rotation around the sun. It's not the sun going up and down over a flat surface. So I'll leave it at that. I can't give you a better explanation than that. But these two stories are interesting and perplexing, but at the same time, they illustrate what I've been trying to tell you, okay, about a flat Earth mentality. All right. So the ancient perspective is this chart here. And we'll talk a little bit about the highest heavens next week. But it is there the gods live, and it's there that we'll see some of the stories, like in Job and others, where there is just this implication that in the highest heavens is a divine assembly. That's as much as I want to say about that tonight. So when the ancients looked up to the sky, they did not have, as the old commercial for I think it was TWA airline that says "Fly the friendly skies." Remember that commercial from long ago? They didn't perceive the skies as friendly, so they associated the skies above them with God's power, and the weather that was occurring around them. The winds are talked about doing God's bidding. The storms are under his control. So this isn't cause effect meteorology here. Um, the hurricane that has just hit Helene has just hit the United States this past week, would be considered the movement of God. God is causing that. You'll read these references here. You'll see that lightning is considered God's weapon. Thunder is considered his voice, those type of things. So it makes sense when we then go back again to this chart that above the waters here, there is the assembly of the gods, and anything that happens above them is the expression of the gods. I'll leave it at that. We'll talk about that more next week. Okay. So in Genesis 1, to go back there, the way you can summarize this is days 1 through 3, God creates habitable zones. And then days 4 through 6, he fills those habitable zones with creatures, humans, birds, and then the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the star. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you tonight is, go back to this again. There's these openings here above the firmament, and you'll read in the Old Testament about gates and doors and windows of heaven. That's what it's talking about, that there's certain openings there that then allows different weather patterns and so forth that the people experience. Now, I said earlier tonight that when the ancients looked up to the stars, they believed that the stars represented the bodies of the gods, and the stars, the brightness of the stars, were the eyes of the gods. Now, I think this probably plays in a little bit to the idea of when you look up and you see Pleiades and you see some of these constellations that represent different figures and different gods. So astrology plays into that. Taurus, the bull, this and that. These constellation of stars are represented as gods, and the light that comes is representing the light from their eyes. Okay. Now, since gods are not just human figures, that's why you have Taurus the bull. You have a god that takes on other creature-like representations as well. Again, an ancient mindset here. That's why you have half man, half animal type gods, and you have some that have the head of a particular creature, but the body of a human, that type of thing. All of this is representing kind of ancient mentality and how they looked at the heavens above them. Now, the one thing that is mentioned in the book of Hebrews is quite interesting to me. In the book of Hebrews, there is the mention of the heavenly tabernacle. Fascinating comment. This idea is that when God commands Moses to build a tabernacle, supposedly, and you can look this up in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, that it is a representation of the heavenly tabernacle up in the heavens. So, you know what I'm going to do? Since we're already at 8 o'clock, there's a video I want to show you because it's done real well. I'll come back to this slide next week because it does play into this idea that not only is there an assembly of the divine gods in the heavens above, but it is also a temple. And the temple is what becomes the pattern for the tabernacle on earth. I'll come back to this slide next week. So here's one way of looking at it. You have a heavenly tabernacle represented in an earthly type, the physical tabernacle. And I'll talk about this next week a little bit. The Garden of Eden is kind of a prototype of a sanctuary within the temple, or a holy of holies. Okay, I'll talk about that a little bit more next week. So I want to show you a video. And it talks about the heavens, and I think it does a very good job. Again, some of my favorite videos that I use come from the Bible Project. And this is 6 minutes long, and it will kind of summarize visually for us what I was trying to explain to you this evening. Then I'll stop the recording. We'll see if you have some thoughts after that. So let's watch the video together at this time.
So in the Bible, the ideas of heaven and earth are ways of talking about God's space and our space.
So I understand our space really well. We live here. There's trees, rivers, mountains. But my understanding of God's space gets a little fuzzy.
And what we do get in the Bible are images trying to help us grasp God's space, which is basically inconceivable to us.
So these are two very different types of spaces.
Yes, they're different in their nature, but here's what's really interesting is that in the Bible, these are not always separate spaces. So think of heaven and earth as like different dimensions that can overlap in the same exact space.
So we talk a lot about going to heaven after we die, but this idea of heaven and earth overlapping, we don't talk a lot about that.
Which is kind of crazy because the union of heaven and earth is what the story of the Bible is all about. How they were once fully united and then driven apart, and about how God is bringing them back together once again.
So let's go back to the beginning. where heaven and earth, they're completely overlapping?
Yeah, this is what the Bible's description of the Garden of Eden is all about. It's a place where God and humanity dwelt together perfectly, no separation, and humans then partner with God in building a flourishing, beautiful world and so on.
But as humans, we wanted to do things a different way. We wanted God out and we wanted to create a world apart from him.
Yeah, so we have these two spaces now, and the Bible actually uses lots of different kinds of words and phrases to refer to these two spaces to make a clear distinction.
So you said that these spaces can overlap, though. So explain how that works.
Yeah, this is where we have to start talking about temples. Because in the biblical world, you experience God's presence by going to a temple. That's where heaven and earth overlap.
Now, there are two types of temples described in the Bible. One is a tabernacle, basically a tent that was built by Moses, and the other was this massive building made by Solomon.
And these temples were decorated with fruit trees and flowers and images of angels and all kinds of gold and jewels and so on. And these are designed to make you feel like you're going back to the garden. And at the center of the temple was a place called the Holy of Holies, which was like the hot spot of God's presence.
Now we can go and be with God again.
But not so fast, because the temple also creates a problem. So God's space is full of his presence and goodness and justice and beauty, but human space is full of sin and injustice and the ugliness that results.
So how do these spaces overlap if they're so different and they're in conflict with each other?
This was resolved through animal sacrifice.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. What do animal sacrifices have to do with this?
Yeah, the idea is this. Animal sacrifices, somehow they absorb the sin when the animal dies in your place. And it creates a clean space, so to speak, where you are now free to enter into the temple and be in God's presence.
Okay, so if I'm an Israelite and I live in Jerusalem, I might be able to be in God's presence. But you said the story of the Bible is all of heaven and earth reuniting.
Right. So we have to keep going in the story where we come to Jesus in the New Testament. And in the Gospel of John, we hear this claim that God became human in Jesus and made his dwelling among us. Now, this word dwelling is really curious. It means he set up a tabernacle among us. And so what John is claiming right here is that Jesus is a temple. He is now the place where heaven and earth overlap.
What's interesting about Jesus is that he isn't staying in this safe, clean space. He's running around hanging out with sinners. He's healing people of their sicknesses and forgiving people of their sins.
He's basically creating little pockets of heaven where people can be in God's presence, but he's doing it out there in the middle of the world of sin and death.
And he keeps telling everyone that the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
And he even told his followers to pray regularly that God's kingdom come and that his will be done here on earth just as it is in heaven.
But a lot of people are threatened by Jesus and they kill him, which seems to spoil this whole plan to reunite heaven and earth.
But we have to go back to a scene earlier on in Jesus' story where John the Baptist saw Jesus and said, "Behold, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world."
So Jesus isn't just talked about as being a temple, he's also talked about as being the temple sacrifice.
Yeah, so the cross is now the place where Jesus absorbs sin to create a clean space that is not limited like animal sacrifices. Jesus' sacrifice has the power to keep spreading and reuniting more and more of heaven and earth.
And this is all really great, but it leaves one big question in my mind, which is what happens when I die? Don't I just fly over to God's space to be with Jesus?
Yeah, so a few times in the New Testament, we learn that Christians will be with Jesus in heaven after they die, but that is not the focus of the Bible story. The focus is on how heaven and earth are being reunited through Jesus and will be completely brought together one day when he returns. So in the book of Revelation, we get this beautiful image of the Garden of Eden, now in the form of a city, coming to end the age of sin and death by redeeming all of human history in a renewed creation. And God's space and human space completely overlap once again.
Okay. So I am going to I'm going to stop our recorded study at this point, and we'll see if you have any thoughts that you want to share. Okay.